some housekeeping before we get going this morning. And today, a little bit more teaching than preaching, but for somebody who gets paid to not always make the distinction, you might get some of both. So, first off, I want to remind you about the team application that's been circling around and floating around there outside in the hallway on the bench. If you serve in any leadership capacity or you have some interest in serving in leadership capacity, as we continue to journey forward into the mission of God and what that looks like in the future, I'm asking you sincerely on my part to you to fill out this team application. Somebody say, you got to fill out an application at your church? Yes. And here's why. I figure that if all of us had to fill out an application to get a job to make provisions, but we're working to join Jesus in transforming the world, I don't figure transforming the world's a less important job than your 9 to 5. And so there's some information that I want to know, because if we're going to do the work of the Lord, I want you to know about me and I want to know about you. So it's pretty straightforward. 6 questions on there. I do actually ask to talk to some people you know. And then on the second sheet, this is just to give you a heads up. So in the not too distant future, you and I will sit down. If you fill one of these out, you and I will sit down one-to-one and talk a little bit about that. And I didn't want to catch you off guard by thinking, oh, he's going to ask me some big super spiritual questions. I just wanted to give you an insight into some of the questions that we might talk about so you could get some level of comfort when we sit down together, or you could just sit down and tell me to be quiet, you don't want to talk. So either way, I didn't want to catch you off guard. So that's the team application. We're reading this book together. I also ask the missional leader, Equipping the Church to Reach a Changing World. Some folks have generously, if you don't have access to the internet or the funding to purchase the book, some folks have generously bought some copies and made them available in the office. So if that's the case, there's some books in the office. You may take one of them. My request to you would be this. Get the book, read it, and then pass it on to somebody in the church that you wish would have read it. Because nothing gets somebody to do something that they don't want to do like a personal invitation. Like a personal invitation. And so you know I mean, come on, this is family. So we know, and this one's mine, you can't have it because you would think probably worse about me than you already do, because all the right. But nothing like inviting somebody into your circle of influence to be able to go in the same direction and to have some common ground to talk about some things. And this book's a great way to do that, just in the context of the church. And you can have people at work read it too. Principles apply everywhere. God didn't limit it just to the church. So, with that, I have one other question, and you all can help me because I'm the new guy. This thing looks like a snake. And I thought, there was some like the people against fiery red serpents, Numbers 21. I thought y'all had some stuff going here that I didn't know about. And I was on the verge of not being Methodist for a minute. I was about to become Pentecostal. So we got to do something about that, because I was getting weirded out over here. I was like, well, it says you shall take them up, but that looks like praying hands that don't bite me, and I didn't get that. So anyway, that's your random commentary into my mind today. That's just the way it works. So if you're journeying along with us, without further ado, we've been looking at Jacob's story. We've been in the book of Genesis, and I hope Jacob's story has been an edifying thing for you. Because Jacob, as one of the patriarchs in the picture of God, his story, he's a mess. Like, there's nothing about Jacob that is the beautiful people mentality that some folks think about the church. You look at Jacob, and like he's like the hooker crook guy in the scripture. He'll go after whatever, and he'd be a great guy to have on your evangelism team, because he is like the by any means necessary kind of fellow. And I think we've seen some of that. And we've started at the end of his journey, and we've been working backwards. And today we get into a part of his story that's is pretty interesting for me. And again, like I said, it's just teaching today. And so we're going to peel some points out of this. As I've prayed and worked in this particular passage this week, I have discovered myself like Jacob. It's almost been like a dream to see what God does and to go, wow. So we're in a dilemma. I got more information than you got time. So who's going to give? Me, I know. So if you brought your Bible with you, if it rings, if you don't mind turning your ringer off, that would be awesome. But turn it on after the service in case I need to call you. Or if you brought your Bible with you, Genesis chapter 28, and it'll be on the screens also. So Jacob now has left Beersheba and went toward Haran at his mother's request, right? Because he and his mom concocted this thing where they stole his older brother's birthright from his dad. And for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with the story, his brother, I picture him like a Gronkowski guy that plays for the New England Patriots, the tight end, big burly dude of dudes, like the man like me who wanted to be tall, dark, and handsome and could sing but had to settle for preaching. And he's hairy all over. Esau, that is, by the way. And so he and Jacob and his mother devised this plan to steal the birthright. They go get goat skin and they put it on Jacob's arms because his brother Esau's hairy and Dad can't see so well. So they put it on there to kind of mask him. And he goes in and he takes the birthright. Anyway, it's some backstory. And so his brother finds out and he's set on killing him. Some of you got brothers who are probably like that toward you. And then they go this way. And Jacob, comes in verse 11 to a certain place. And anytime you see certain place in the book of Genesis, it's not just pointing to a certain place. So the writer in Genesis is intent on teaching God's people the history of worship. And Luz, or Bethel, in the early Israelite history was a huge place, right? So it was, you remember in the New Testament how all worship for Jewish people had to come around Israel or Jerusalem, right? You're always reading about Jesus coming back, making his pilgrimage back, because the synagogue, the temple, was centralized worship. You didn't have the luxury of being like us. You can just pick any of the 94 different synagogues in your neighborhood to go to on any given Saturday afternoon. You had to go to the place. And the Genesis writer is intent on letting us know with this certain place, they're giving us a little bit of our history. We're learning that early on in even our today Christ Central church family's history, our place, a central place, a really important, a certain place, was at this place we learned that's called Luz, or Bethel. And so part of our worship, part of what we do every Sunday morning has its roots, it tracks all the way back to this certain place. And so when you see it, it'd be easy to read by and go, a certain place? What, they didn't have directions or what? It's in the Hebrew, it's this way the writer is kind of alluding to something without actually having to say it. So there's your background for a certain place, and he stayed there for the night because the sun is set. And he's taken a stone, Jacob is, he takes one of the stones of the place and he put it under his head and lays down in the place. Not the greatest translation in the English. In the Hebrew, what it says is that Jacob, in net effect, he surveys the scene and he sees all these rocks and he sees one and he kind of, it's almost like he gets behind it. And so it's not that he uses a rock for a pillow, because he's not the kind of guy we want to follow if he does that. He almost like he hides behind it. And that's not even the important part. The important part is what we're going to get down to in just a minute. And he dreams, these fantastic dreams, that there was a ladder set up on the earth. And the top of it reaches all the way to the heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending down it. And the Lord stood beside him. Don't you love that? Don't you love, like, it's the God, the Hebrew writer makes it so that it's very graphic, and it's almost like you're like if I just came and sat down beside you. It's like God gives him this grand vision, and God himself comes over and stands by him and is like, well, what do you think? And I would have probably went away screaming. I mean, this is when God gives you a vision, sometimes it takes over your mind. And so he sees them going up and down, and the Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord. Again, you can't see it in the English, but it's our ancient name for Yahweh. And Jacob is intent. There's this great dialogue back and forth in this particular text. Jacob's intent on, he uses a word that just is like generic God. Like people all the time tell you today, oh, I believe in God. The God of what? And God comes down and introduces himself as a specific God. Yahweh. In fact, it's what you call the divine tetragrammaton. There you go. There's your seminary education paying for you today. It's a name for God that is so holy that God's people won't even speak it. It's the name God uses to introduce himself to Moses when he catches a bush on fire and it does not burn up. He says, I am the Lord. And so God early on distinguishes himself from all the other gods in Canaan where Jacob has been, and all the other gods that maybe, and I think, not all scholars agree with me, but they have the right to be wrong. I think because Jacob isn't yet the monotheist, he's not quite the guy that we want to follow, and that's part of the story, is that Jacob finds himself in the midst of trying to wrestle through, is this Yahweh that I hear about from my dad, but is he like these other gods that, and I think Jacob even worships. And so I try that on for size, that your history, my history, our history of being Jesus followers comes through people who didn't always know how to worship this one true God. What do you do with that? Like our history, even in us, we're conflicted about who this God is that speaks to us and announces himself as, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac, and the land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Next one, please, sir. And your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. Here's your glimpse back into the Hebrew once again, that north, south, east, and west thing. The word that he uses, oh, and I love it because it's so graphic. It's the word that he uses. You ever had a Coke that was under pressure? You're going in the house, and she's already sent you to the car 15 times, men, to get all those groceries, and you're going, what are we going to do with all this stuff? And the last thing you get are the Cokes that are in those little plastic ring deals. You pick it up kind of, and one of them falls out and it hits the ground and it's like a ping pong. And what's the first thing you don't do? Well, and why is it that you don't open it? So these isn't rhetorical questions. It's okay to be louder. Because it's going to make a mess, right? It's going to spew everywhere. That's the kind of thing that the Hebrew word does right there. The Hebrew word, God tells Jacob that your descendants are going to be like, we've been shaking up the Coke, and we're going to unleash them on the world, and they're going to spew everywhere. You can't get away from them. It's going to make a colossal mess. Man, you can't see that, but think about it. Don't you really stand in awe of the fact that God's word continues to be true? I mean, you're not here because God isn't faithful. You stand as evidence that the writer, used the right word, because we're descendants in the same line as Jacob. And I don't know about you, but I don't look Jewish, whatever that looks like. I don't look like a Middle Eastern guy. And think about that for a minute. Try that on for size. That God spoke in probably 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 BC. And here you sit in 2018 and see that, wow, what he promised turned out to be true. Isn't that crazy? Man, that's fantastic. So anyway, we go on to verse 15. I was impressed with that word. I know you are too, because you're trying to get your head around it right now. So now that I know that I am with you, and that I will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And in 16, Jacob woke up from his dream and said, just like we sang, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. We got to stop right there, because that one's just too good. I did not know it. So it's one of the great things that's inside this text is if it wasn't for the fact that Jacob and his mom concocted this theft story and this whole goatskin thing and all that stuff we talked about in the intro, if it weren't for that, we're to the point when Jacob says, and I did not know it. If he doesn't have to go on the lam, if he doesn't have to run from a brother that's willing to kill him because he stole his birthright, Jacob accidentally runs into God. mind-boggling to me. And most of the time, in the context of the church, people tell us that we're supposed to be on the look for God, and Jacob is the last thing he's on the look for is the Lord. And if it weren't for an absolute scandalous scoundrel activity, this certain place, Jacob would have probably never discovered. And I want to press on that for a little bit. Isn't that like most people's story? Aren't you minding your business, living the good life, doing your thing, paying your taxes, going and looking the part in the community? But isn't that what happens? That most of the time some incident shows up in your life. Some incident shows up in the life of one of your kids, one of your grandkids, one of your coworkers. For instance, they get married and then all of a sudden they decide they don't want to be married no more. And they have this crisis of faith. And they show up on things. Or somebody thought they were going to have a job and they got to a point where a younger kid would work cheap than an older hand would. And all of a sudden you're without a job. And you're not looking for God. You're just trying to do what you do. And all of a sudden you find life turned upside down and downside up and you don't know which way's right. And you're just going along and all of a sudden you have this serendipity moment where you just trip over it and you look around. You find God. It's the beauty of the story here is that one of the beauties of the story is that Jacob had no intention of doing anything other than what was on his mind. And somehow, some way, through the grace of God, he orchestrated, he turned, like Bugs Bunny used to say. He helped him make a left turn at Albuquerque. He pops up out of the hole and he ends up at this certain place and he has this dream and all of a sudden he goes, wow, I had no idea God was here. Isn't that really kind of how it happens to you and I? Sometimes we're going along, just what I was trying to get out there, you're going along in life and you trip over something in life and on the other side the fall is going to skin you up, it's going to look really bad, and then you have this serendipity where you go, I didn't even know God was here. Surely God is in this place. We're going to get to it in just a second, the rest of that. All right, so where did I get? Verse 17. And he was afraid. How awesome is this place? Now, we could take the text and only stick right here and focus on this certain place thing and just talk about the holiness that God's people have of certain places, i.e. the local church in today's terms. Because part of this story has two absolute themes in it. One is about how the holy place gets started, how the place of worship gets started for God's people. And the other one is this accidental finding of God. And we're going to visit on the accidental one a little bit more today than being in space here. All right, so the next slide, sir. This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate to heaven, which, by the way, the gate to heaven is where you would actually, in the Hebrew, it would give us the impression that it says it's the place where you and I could approach where God lives. And so in this dream Jacob has, it's this stairway, this ramp, or whatever it is. It comes down, and it's very important in this certain place. Jacob could see the end of it. It's not like the rainbow when it rains this afternoon, and you're looking for where the leprechaun will slide out, and you can't really see it because it goes over into Glencoe. It's not like that. Is that Jacob's dreaming, and he could see the actual ladder come down to where he was, which reminds him that it's not over there where God lives. It's right here where I am. I am in his presence. And when he says the gates of heaven, it gives the impression that this is the spot, kind of like the church. This is the spot where we might have access. And some of us Jesus followers would say Jesus is the spot where we might have access to God himself. Man, that's great. And so Jacob rose early in the morning and he took the stone, verse 18, he put under his head, which he didn't put under his head, but that's what it says, and set up a pillar and poured oil on top of it. And he called the place Bethel. But the name of the city was Luz at first. Again, geographically locating for you, this is an important certain place for us. And then Jacob made a vow, right? We talked about that in the first week that I was here. Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear. Stop right there before you change it, Donnie. This is where I want to get to today. Jacob makes this vow, and it's helpful for you and I. Last week we talked about this notion of not forfeiting our birthright. And boy, I'm going to have to get on the horse here and ride. Not forfeiting our birthright. And this week, because part of the challenge last week was young folks to get a mentor and somebody that can speak into your life and that could reach you and talk to you that's not your parents. And those of you that are parents in here, part of the challenge was to find somebody like that to say, I see in you something magnificent. You remember the sermon? If you can, I hope it's online. You can go and watch it. But today, I think the roadblock in that for all of us is, how do I do it? And Jacob, I think, articulates a step-by-step process, even though he has no idea that he does it. Let's look at what he says. He says, if God will go with me. Well, what more does he ask for than God's presence? And in fact, it's kind of weird that God already says he's going to do all this stuff. And Jacob says, God says, I'm going to go with you. And Jacob says, well, if he'll go with me, I will. And it's kind of the where I come back to today is this presence idea. And for us Methodists, we get that. Whether you're a lifelong Jesus follower or whether you're not a Jesus follower yet, it's this idea of assurance. God promised he's going to be around. God promises he's going with us. So it's not a question of whether or not if God will go with me. It's whether or not you accidentally run into God or you accidentally discover that God, here's your Methodist part today, that God's out ahead of you working already. That somehow when you leave from Beersheba and you're headed to the Haran in life, when you're here and you're trying to get to there, somehow, even in your unbeknownst to any of us, that God is in that line somewhere. He's not determining how you go, because we don't think of God as deterministic like that. But he is orchestrating, yeah, that's a good word. He's orchestrating certain events. There might have been 15 ways to Haran. Why did he choose this one? That's the grace of God at work. And you say, well, how is it that, how can I know that God's present with me? How can I know the assurance that God has made to Jacob? He made that in the old time, but maybe that doesn't go for me. Well, read the book of John. What did Jesus say? I'm not leave you or forsake you. What does he say beyond that? I'm even going to send somebody to go along with you. Everywhere you go, the presence of God is with us. And here's the best way to know, practically speaking, in your life every day. So, unbeknownst to all of us, we have a tendency sometimes to think that there's inherent goodness in us. That is not the case. All you need to do is go to Walmart. There's no inherent goodness in people whatsoever. But isn't it true that you really do isn't it true that people don't even, in your life, don't even know, believe, or follow Jesus? Don't they do good stuff? I mean, yeah, they do. You have kids, grandkids, neighbors, friends, co-workers. You want them to know Jesus. You want them to claim him, but they just don't. But they still do all this really great stuff. Well, for us, that's evidence of the fact that God somewhere in his grace, part of his presence, is he has restored our ability to do certain good works. And it's not any inherent goodness in us doing it. It's the grace of God working through us. So every time I see a scoundrel do something good, like open a door or say thank you or pay a tithe or anything like that, you don't have to be a part of the church. Any goodness that goes on, that's not inherent good in you and I. That's evidence that God's presence is with us, that God goes along with us. Now try that on for size. You mean, as awful as I've been in parts of my life, even God was going along. Yeah, that's what Jacob's whole story's about. Is that you can't be bad enough to keep the goodness of God to get in you. Because why? God has promised his presence. Now, what does that have to do with mentoring? And I can already tell y'all we're not going to get through all these steps. What does that have to do with mentoring? Here's the thing. All you need to do is sometimes people don't understand that God's presence goes with them. And all they need is you and I, one of God's people, just to come alongside and be in proximity to say, hey, that is awesome. You are killing it right here in life. And you know what? That is evidence that God is at work in you. God is doing some fantastic things in you. Even that scoundrel boss you work for, even them, God is at work in them. And it just, like sometimes Christians have to lead up in life. And to see the goodness in other people and not say, oh, you're a good person, you're fine. You say that God is with you, like it or not. He's working through you in the world. And so that's as far as I got time for us to go on this presence thing. But look at what else you do in this step-by-step process of how to come alongside with somebody. And if God will keep me along the way that I go. Well, what more is that than guidance? That'd be my word. So Jacob might say it this way: if God would guide me along this path, we just establish the fact that his grace, he's orchestrating, he's helping to guide. But in our world, and I'm going to have to leave some holes because you want to get to Sunday school, and forgive me. I'll do better next week. But it's in our lives, what more than this is when you come alongside somebody, this is just about having godly counsel and wisdom. Giving guidance. I heard a fellow this week tell me that he was a Proverbs kind of guy. I love that. And for those of you who don't read the Bible very often, and I don't mean any offense by that, but Proverbs is like this great book wedged right in the middle of the Scripture that if you're a pragmatist, a United States citizen, and you're looking for good, solid, everyday advice, go to Proverbs. You got a wife that you don't know what to deal with, go to Proverbs. You got a husband that's a lazy man, go to Proverbs. You got people who got some real problems in the world that you don't really know how to behave around them, and you've been praying for fire from heaven on their head, go to Proverbs, and then read Psalms, because David's doing that too. But that's altogether a different story. It is this whole notion, if Jacob says, if God will go with me along this way, how many people in your life do you know that would really be able to experience some resolution, some real sure enough grace of God, if somebody would just come along with them and go along beside them? That they would that you could be godly counsel for them. That they could say, what is this thing that you do? And even the best, I don't know all the answers. It's just guidance. It's just somebody to hold your hand when they want their hand held, or somebody that'll put their arm around them when they want somebody to put their arm around them, or somebody that'll just shut up and not offer any good wisdom, but just offer the ministry of presence. Just good guidance. So Jacob says, if God will just go along, if he'll guide me along, I think it's instructive for us in our lives together and in the lives of the people we love and are trying to reach, if we will just go and offer good, solid guidance when it's appropriate. And the Vav, and give me bread to eat. Pause. So Jacob says, and if God will give me nourishment, if God will feed me. And I was reminded of the way, I don't have any doubt that Jacob was actually talking about, like, I want to eat. I'm going on this journey, and I don't have any money, and my resume won't get me much in the job market that I'm working on because I don't even know how to change a tire. Remember, that's what we talked about several times. We've laughed at this. It gives the picture that Jacob's not a very handy sort of dude, and that he's going out into the world with no basic marketable job skills. God will feed me and take care of me. God will feed me. He asked about this notion of nourishment. You remember what Jesus tells the people? But is not the body more than food? And I'm going to expand this one a little bit. And I concede this is a meism, so it's 99% wrong. But if it's 1% right, it's good. So here we go. I'm going to expand this into the whole notion of what Jacob's getting at is if God will take care of me, if he will make me whole, both physically and emotionally. God will feed me. Because as we can tell from Jacob's story, there's something missing in this old boy. There's something in him, some desire that he can't satisfy. And he's consuming everything in his path. He's stealing it. He's taking it. He's doing whatever. There's something about him that needs nourished. And he articulates that in his vow here. He just says that God will take care of me along the way. I think that what he's pointing at is all of our just sharing out loud, that we have a deep sense of something's missing on our own. Physically, something's missing. Emotionally, something's missing. And Jacob says, if God will do this. That's why I love part of Celebrate Recovery. Those will be the people who really work the system, AA, NA as well. They're the healthiest people on the earth. You know why? Because they look at themselves and go, man, I'm a wreck. But God's shaping this. God's doing something. Because they're on this, they're being nourished by the Spirit of God and they're being moved to becoming a whole person and not just a fragmented individual anymore. And he goes on, he says, if he'll give me clothes to wear. And he says, I'm going to say he's talking about provision. How many times in your life has God not made provision? Jacob doesn't know this, and I think it's part of him getting to know this Yahweh that introduced himself, and Jacob thinking about this God that might be like these other gods that's floating around. He's not. He's talking about this provision notion. If he'll give me clothes to wear, if he'll take care of me. I was in the shower one day. Sometimes the Lord speaks to me in the shower. Because I don't sing, he's got space. I was in the shower one day, and I was lamenting the fact that the organizational structure of Methodism is a wreck. It's not news to you. And turning over in my mind a conversation I'd had with a church leader, and I have a bad tendency of ruminating, turning it over and over and over and over and over and over and over, and never letting it go. Kelly will testify to that. You can see her after service for counseling tips. But I was turning it over, and almost as clearly as you hear me right now, God said, do you think the United Methodist Church will do a better job taking care of you than me? Thought she had looked in. What? Repeat. Do you think United Methodist Church do a better job taking care of you than me? No, sir. No, sir, I don't. And this is the kind, I only share that story with you for no other reason than I think this is the kind of place that Jacob gets, that God speaks as crystal clear to him and says, and Jacob's just articulating, if God will make sure that I'm taken care of, because I have some genuine concerns that I'm not going to be taken care of. Sound like anybody you know? It's easy to have gigantic faith right here, isn't it? Easy to have it right. Easy to have it in your Sunday school class. But Monday's coming. It ain't so easy when you get out in the real world to remember, right? That there's never been a time in your life when God has not provided for you. If you've made it this far in, if you're not dead, he has not quit making provision. Thank you. Amen to that. If you're not dead, he's not done. And Jacob, though, he just articulates for us. But we're worried. And when you come alongside someone else, they think that too. Whenever you're mentoring someone, you ask them about being a part of their lives, and you're like, how is God going to do this stuff? How am I going to make it through? Sometimes you have to hold the line and say, I don't know how God does it, but I just know he does it. Jacob didn't know how he did it either. But because you can rest in the proven fact that the next time God lies to you will be the first time he lies to you. And that you have the assurance that he ain't lied to anybody who's followed him yet. The Spirit of God lives in you, lives in me, lives in all of us to work in the world to remind other people that God has never not made provision for those who love and seek him. And so when we go along beside other people in life, we don't have to know how it happens. We just have to remind ourselves and other people, God's faithful. All right, now let's get to the last one here. So that, here's the result. Do all those things so that I come again to my Father's house in peace. Here's the last one I want to point to you. That God provides a purpose for us as well. That Jacob doesn't know it yet, but it looks like he just wants to get back home. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. You ever been places like that? I went to Chicago, Illinois one time, and I uttered the same words as Jacob. He just let me get back to my daddy's house. You won't ever find me in this place again. Never. Black, 12 o'clock in the afternoon. I could see the sun up there, but it wasn't hitting the ground. It is just crazy. Crazy. I mean, you ever have that kind of feeling? Jacob's got this kind of idea that I've wandered off into a place, and I don't like everything that's familiar for me, everything that I know, everything that all the provision that was made for me, all the love and care that was there for me, I don't have access to anymore. And God, if you would just be faithful to get me back to where I had comfort, I promise. Now, some of y'all think I've been reading your mail when I just said that. That's a prayer God's people pray over and over and over again. Lord, if you could just take us back to where we're comfortable, we promise we'll make you our God again. And Jacob just articulates for us this idea, but it's not really, that's not even really the point. The whole point is to get down to in peace. He doesn't know it, but he just really wants to be at peace. Isn't that true for you too? Like, isn't it true that you just, you'll hear me say this a lot, I don't want any more cheese, I just want out of the trap. I just want peace. All your kids, that's why you're glad that grown up moved out of your house. Peace has come back. We just seek it. And that's what God's seeking in the world. That's why he invites us along the way, and that's imperative for us to discover our purpose, because we can figure out how to join God in his mission of restoring peace to the earth, this Hebrew notion of shalom. It's restoring things where there's no longer enmity between you and I. We can go to Walmart, and it's an edifying place where people dress properly, and they all know Jesus. I mean, amen. It's fantastic. It's this whole notion of you don't have to worry about, like I talked about last week, young folks, or because for many of us adults who've lived enough life to have the scars and dents to prove it, is you don't have to live in a way that you have to lay in bed at night wondering about, have I forfeited my purpose? Because God has restored peace in your life. Jacob has no idea that some guy like me is going to be peeling parts out of an answer that he gave to a God that I'm not even sure he really was interested in following right off. And use it to help you and I discover the fact that God can call us. He gives us a way to journey along with each other and to journey along with those that I know you've been, just as you mentioned a minute ago, that we've been praying for, that you've been praying for. You say, how do I really do this, disciple, this Jesus thing? Because all these things Jesus is doing for you too. His presence is there. His guidance is there. He is feeding us. He is making provision for us. And he is helping us restore our purpose and understand what that is. And how does he do that with us and those we know and love? He gives you the steps. He gives you the steps and reminds us this morning that because he is faithful, his Spirit lives in those who love and know him. He is with us. You know that. He will guide us, and he will use us, if we will let him, to help guide other people in our lives. He will use your story, your facts, your information, how he has fed you to nourish other people too, if you'll share it. And when they think that God has quit making provision for the world because they love to watch Fox News and CNN, and I don't disagree with them when I watch it either, but you can remind them, no. You don't come to church and hear about how God made provision for a lady that that doctor said she had cancer, but after some prayers, she don't have cancer no more. How God's making provision for people through the food pantry that they don't have provision and they don't know where their food insecurity is going to get met, but God manages to do it. How kids on the other side of the world don't know what it is to celebrate the birth of Jesus, but we call this thing Christmas, and we send gifts on the other side of the world. Why? Because we want kids to have Christmas like us? No. Because we want them to look inside the box and go, wow, God made provision for us. God shows that he's faithful. He don't tell no lies. And that somehow, someday, all people, even those ones you know and love, can find their purpose. They can discover what it is. They can come in a group like this and see that, God, we're a group of people that are working with Jesus to transform the world, and we don't even like each other all the time. But if you're interested in joining Jesus and transforming the world, you come on and join in with us. You'll find a group of people that are stumbling around and fumbling around through the dark just like Jacob, but we're doing our best to understand what our purpose is, and it's inspirational to know for us and for the world that God's word is still faithful, that he gives us our identity, self-identity. We don't have to worry about who other people tell us we ought to be or could be or might be. God told us who we are, and we're the people who are joining him as he transforms the world because we understand what our purpose is. You don't know nobody in your life that don't want to know what their purpose is too. And part of that is to have peace restored. And so this week when you go out, you go, how am I going to start the conversation? I just gave you 5 pieces. Now, next week when I ask about God sightings, like I told you, it's more of a teaching day than preaching. Next week when we have an opportunity to talk about God sightings, I hope you have a story that says, you know what? When I shared about God's making provision, this is what happened. As this is the venue to do it, where God reminds us, just like Jacob, that he is in this certain place. And because of the power of the resurrected Son of God in Jesus, when we say yes to him, he is in this certain place too. And he empowers us to go do everything that we see in Jacob this morning. And more so, if we'll be faithful to do it. Let those be the words that guide you as you go out into the world to turn it upside down, not for your own glory, but as you point to everybody else and say, nah, we're just joining Jesus and transforming the world. You can come and join us. I've talked enough, so I'm going to pray. Father, thank you